He laughed at her old shoes in front of an entire luxury showroom. But less than 24 hours later, the sound of a Rolls Royce Convoy pulling into the parking lot would make his smile disappear forever. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city and state in the comments below, and if you believe people should never be judged by their appearance, take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who still believes kindness matters. These stories are more than entertainment. They remind people what dignity really looks like. Now, back to a leaner haze. The polished marble floors of Colebrook Luxury Motors reflected the soft glow of crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling nearly 30 feet above the showroom. Rows of handcrafted Rolls Royces, Bentleys, and Aston Martins gleamed beneath the lights like museum pieces reserved for the wealthy elite of Boston. Salesmen in tailored suits moved carefully between clients carrying leather folders and espresso cups, their voices low and polished, their smiles rehearsed to perfection. And then a leaner haze quietly walked through the front entrance wearing faded blue jeans, a cream-colored sweater, and a pair of old brown loafers whose leather had softened from years of use. At 38 years old, Eleanor carried herself with calm confidence, though most people never noticed it at first. Her light brown hair rested neatly over one shoulder, and her expression remained peaceful despite the immediate stares that followed her across the showroom floor. She paused near a midnight black Rolls Royce Phantom, gently running her fingertips across the smooth finish, as if admiring a work of art rather than a machine worth nearly $600,000. Several sales associates exchanged amused looks from across the room. One whispered something under his breath that made another smirk into his coffee cup. Then Brandon Cole appeared. At 42, Brandon was the sales manager everyone at Colebrook feared and admired in equal measure. His navy Italian suit fit perfectly against his broad frame, and the silver watch on his wrist caught the light each time he moved. He prided himself on reading people within seconds. Wealthy clients received warmth, everyone else received distance, and the moment his eyes dropped to Eleanor's worn shoes, he had already decided exactly who she was. Brandon approached with a smile so polished it almost looked genuine. "Ma'am," he said smoothly, clasping his hands together, "the public showroom is on the other side of the building. The Phantom collection is reserved for scheduled buyers." Eleanor turned toward him slowly. "I was actually hoping to ask a few questions about this model," she replied softly. Brandon's smile tightened slightly. Around them, conversations began to quiet. "Of course," he said, though his tone suggested the opposite. "These vehicles usually attract serious collectors." His eyes drifted downward again toward her shoes, not casual visitors. A faint ripple of laughter came from a nearby desk. Eleanor remained perfectly still. No anger crossed her face, no embarrassment, only silence. Brandon stepped closer to the Phantom and tapped the hood lightly. "This particular car starts at $580,000, he continued loudly enough for nearby customers to hear. "People who purchase Rolls Royces generally don't walk in wearing shoes like those." The room went silent for half a second before a few restrained chuckles broke through the tension. Eleanor lowered her eyes briefly toward her old loafers, then back toward Brandon. And somehow, her calm expression unsettled him more than anger ever could. Eleanor Hayes had spent most of her life learning that the loudest people in a room were usually the ones trying hardest to prove their worth. That was why she never argued when someone underestimated her. She simply observed them quietly and let time reveal the truth on its own. The faint laughter still echoed behind her as she turned away from the Rolls Royce Phantom and walked slowly across the marble showroom floor. Every step of her worn loafers made a soft sound against the polished stone, while nearby salesmen watched her with expressions that balanced somewhere between amusement and pity. Brandon Cole straightened his suit jacket with satisfaction, convinced he had just protected the prestige of the dealership from an embarrassment. Eleanor paused briefly near the glass entrance doors and glanced back one final time toward the black Phantom beneath the showroom lights. For a split second, Her calm blue eyes rested on Brandon with an expression he could not quite understand. It was not anger. It was not humiliation. If anything, it looked almost like disappointment. Then she quietly stepped outside into the cold Boston afternoon. The November wind carried the scent of rain through the city streets as Alina crossed toward a modest, dark gray sedan parked along the curb beside the dealership. The car itself looked ordinary among the luxury vehicles surrounding Colebrook Motors, and that was exactly how Alina preferred it. She opened the driver's side door slowly and placed a small leather folder onto the passenger seat beside her. Inside, the folder sat acquisition documents worth nearly $80 million. By the following week, if everything proceeded according to schedule, Colebrook Luxury Motors and its parent company would officially become part of Hayes Automotive Holdings, the private investment group Alina secretly controlled alongside a small board of silent partners. Yet almost nobody in Boston knew her face. Alina had built her reputation deliberately in private. No magazine interviews, no social media presence, no flashy appearances at charity galas. Just quiet business deals conducted behind closed doors. She rested her hands on the steering wheel for several seconds without starting the engine. Inside the showroom, Brandon had already moved on, laughing with another salesman near the espresso bar while recounting the interaction. One younger employee named Ethan glanced nervously toward the glass doors. "I think maybe you were a little hard on her," he admitted carefully. Brandon scoffed loudly. "You do not survive in luxury sales by entertaining people who cannot afford the merchandise." Ethan lowered his eyes, unconvinced. Meanwhile, Alina finally started the sedan and slowly pulled away from the curb. The city lights reflected softly across her windshield as traffic moved through downtown Boston. Her phone buzzed through the car speakers moments later. "Did the meeting go well?" asked a calm, older voice on the line. It belonged to Charles Whitmore, one of the senior board members working beside Alina on the acquisition. Alina allowed herself a faint smile. "It was informative," she answered quietly. Charles chuckled softly. "That bad?" Alina glanced briefly into the rearview mirror as the towering Colebrook dealership disappeared behind her. "Let us just say," she replied, "some people become so distracted by appearances that they forget how quickly power can change hands." Silence lingered for a moment before Charles spoke again. "The board finalized everything this morning. Once you approve it, the transfer becomes public tomorrow at 9 o'clock sharp." Alina's fingers rested lightly against the steering wheel. Outside, rain began tapping gently against the windshield while Boston traffic slowed beneath glowing streetlights. "Good," she said calmly. "Then tomorrow morning, we will pay Colebrook Luxury Motors another visit." The following morning, Colebrook Luxury Motors opened under gray winter skies and the sharp scent of fresh coffee drifting through the showroom. Employees moved across the polished marble floors, preparing for another day of wealthy clients and high-pressure sales. Brandon Cole stood near the front desk adjusting his tie while reviewing inventory numbers on a digital tablet. The confidence in his posture had fully returned overnight. To him, Alina Hayes had already become nothing more than a funny story to repeat during lunch breaks. "You should have seen her face," Brandon said, while smirking at two sales associates gathered near the espresso machine. "Some people honestly believe walking into a luxury dealership magically makes them important." One salesman laughed under his breath while another shook his head. Only Ethan remained quiet. He had barely slept after witnessing the interaction the previous afternoon. Something about Alina's calm silence continued bothering him in ways he could not explain. "I still think she handled it better than most people would have," Ethan admitted carefully. Brandon rolled his eyes. "That is because people like that are used to hearing the truth." Before Ethan could respond, the low, distant rumble of engines echoed outside the glass walls of the showroom. At first, the sound blended into normal city traffic. Then it grew louder, deeper, more deliberate. Conversations across the dealership slowly faded as heads turned toward the front windows. A long black Rolls Royce Phantom appeared first, gliding smoothly into the circular driveway like something from a presidential motorcade. Behind it came another. Then another. 4 identical black Rolls Royces moved in perfect silence beneath the morning drizzle while security vehicles followed behind them. The entire showroom froze. One customer lowered his coffee cup mid-sip. A receptionist stood up so quickly her chair rolled backward across the floor. Brandon straightened immediately, his entire demeanor transforming into polished professionalism. "Everyone move," he ordered sharply. "Those are executive clients." Employees rushed toward the entrance doors while the convoy settled into position outside beneath the silver Colebrook sign. Rain reflected against the glossy black paint of the vehicles while suited security personnel stepped out first, scanning the area calmly. Brandon smoothed his jacket and forced a confident smile onto his face. "This," he muttered quietly toward Ethan, "is what real money looks like." Then the rear passenger door of the lead Phantom slowly opened. The smile vanished from Brandon's face almost instantly. Eleanor Hayes stepped out wearing the same old brown loafers from the day before. The same calm eyes. The same quiet expression. Only this time she was followed by 5 sharply dressed executives carrying leather portfolios and tablets. The air inside the showroom seemed to disappear all at once. Ethan's mouth fell open slightly while several salesmen exchanged confused glances. Brandon stared as realization began creeping slowly across his face. Eleanor adjusted the sleeve of her cream-colored coat before calmly looking up at the Colebrook dealership sign overhead. Rain tapped softly against the pavement around her while security held umbrellas nearby. Then another vehicle door opened behind her. Charles Whitmore stepped out carrying a thick black folder embossed with the silver logo of Hayes Automotive Holdings. The moment Brandon saw the logo, the color drained from his face completely. He recognized it instantly. Everyone in the luxury automotive industry did. Hayes Automotive Holdings controlled dealerships, manufacturing contracts, and investment partnerships worth billions across the country. Brandon suddenly remembered the acquisition rumors circulating for weeks. The secret buyer. The silent investor nobody had ever seen publicly. His throat tightened. Inside the showroom, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The room had gone completely silent. And standing there beneath the cold Boston rain, Eleanor Hayes finally looked directly at Brandon Cole again. Brandon Cole felt his pulse pounding so hard he could hear it over the rain striking the dealership windows. Just 12 hours earlier, he had laughed at the woman now standing outside surrounded by executives, security personnel, and a convoy worth millions of dollars. The confidence that usually defined him began slipping away one painful second at a time. Across the showroom floor, employees stood frozen beside polished Bentleys and Rolls Royces, watching the impossible scene unfold beneath the gray Boston sky. Eleanor Hayes climbed the dealership steps slowly, her old brown loafers darkened slightly by the rainwater glistening against the marble entrance. Yet somehow those worn shoes carried more authority now than every tailored suit inside the building combined. Charles Whitmore opened the glass doors first, stepping aside respectfully as Eleanor entered the showroom. The quiet sound of her footsteps echoed through the massive room while security remained outside near the convoy. Nobody dared speak. Brandon forced himself to move forward, though the stiffness in his legs made each step feel unnatural. "Miss Hayes," he finally said, attempting a smile that collapsed halfway across his face. "If we had known who you were yesterday, I assure you the experience would have been very different." Eleanor stopped several feet in front of him. Her expression remained calm, unreadable. "That," she replied softly, "is precisely the problem." The words landed harder than shouting ever could. Somewhere behind the sales floor, a coffee cup quietly clinked against a glass desk. Nobody else moved. Charles Whitmore stepped forward holding the black portfolio against his chest. "As of 8:45 this morning," he announced clearly, Hayes Automotive Holdings officially finalized acquisition of Colebrook Luxury Motors and all affiliated regional operations. A collective hush swept through the showroom. Several employees exchanged stunned glances, while one salesman visibly lost color in his face. Ethan looked toward Alina with disbelief mixed with admiration. Brandon swallowed hard. He suddenly understood every detail he had ignored the previous afternoon. The calm demeanor, the lack of defensiveness, the silence. Alina had never needed his approval because she already possessed more power than anyone in the building. And he had humiliated her anyway. Charles opened the portfolio and handed several documents toward the dealership owner, Richard Langford, who had rushed downstairs moments earlier after hearing about the convoy outside. The older man looked pale beneath the bright showroom lights as he quickly skimmed the paperwork. "Miss Hayes," Richard said nervously, "I had no idea you would be visiting personally." Alina nodded politely. "I prefer seeing businesses for myself before making final decisions." Brandon felt cold realization settle deep in his stomach. Final decisions. His eyes drifted downward for half a second toward Alina's old shoes, the exact shoes he had mocked publicly. Suddenly, every word he had spoken replayed in his mind with brutal clarity. People who purchase Rolls Royces generally do not walk in wearing shoes like those. The room seemed smaller now, tighter, suffocating beneath the weight of humiliation turning back toward its source. Alina slowly walked past Brandon toward the black phantom displayed beneath the chandelier lights. Her fingertips brushed gently across the polished hood exactly as they had the day before. "Beautiful craftsmanship," she said quietly. "It deserves better representation." Brandon closed his eyes briefly. Around him, nobody defended him anymore. Not the laughing salesmen, not the executives, not even Richard Langford. The silence inside the showroom had become merciless. Alina turned calmly toward the gathered employees. "Luxury," she said softly, "was never meant to make people feel small." Several workers lowered their eyes instantly. Ethan stood completely still near the espresso bar, watching the scene unfold like something out of a movie. Alina's gaze finally returned to Brandon one last time. "You judged my value before learning my name," she said, "and that mistake costs companies far more than money." The room went silent again. Brandon Cole had spent nearly 15 years mastering the art of making wealthy people feel important. He knew how to recognize designer watches from across a showroom, how to spot custom Italian suits, how to calculate status from a single glance. But standing there beneath the crystal lights of Colebrook Luxury Motors, he realized something terrifying. None of those instincts had taught him how to recognize character. The silence surrounding him felt heavier with every passing second. Employees who had laughed beside him the day before now avoided eye contact completely. Richard Langford adjusted his tie nervously while flipping through the acquisition documents with trembling fingers. Even the customers browsing near the Bentleys had stopped pretending to shop. Everyone in the showroom understood the same thing now. The woman Brandon publicly humiliated was not simply wealthy. She was the most powerful person in the building. Alina Hayes stood calmly beside the Black Phantom while rainwater slowly dried against her old brown loafers. She looked completely unaffected by the tension filling the room around her. That composure unsettled Brandon more than anger ever could. Most people in her position would have enjoyed humiliating him back, but Alina's restraint carried something far more uncomfortable: disappointment. Charles Whitmore stepped beside her and quietly handed over a tablet displaying employee records and dealership reports. Alina reviewed the information silently for several moments while the showroom remained frozen in uneasy anticipation. Then her eyes stopped on one section: customer complaints. She studied the screen carefully before lifting her gaze toward Richard Langford. "There are 73 formal complaints regarding employee conduct over the past 3 years," she said calmly. Richard's face tightened immediately. "Miss Hayes, luxury environments can occasionally create misunderstandings with clients." Alina raised one hand gently, stopping him without effort. 31 complaints specifically mention humiliation based on appearance. Nobody moved. The room had become so quiet that the faint ticking of a showroom clock echoed across the marble floor. Eleanor handed the tablet back to Charles before slowly turning toward the sales staff gathered near the front desk. "A business reflects what leadership allows," she said softly. "People do not become cruel by accident, they become comfortable." Brandon felt the words strike directly into his chest. He remembered every dismissive laugh, every sarcastic comment, every time he made someone feel small simply because they looked ordinary. At the time it had felt harmless, normal even. Now it sounded ugly inside his own memory. Ethan quietly stepped forward from the edge of the group. "Miss Hayes," he said carefully, "not everyone here agreed with what happened yesterday." Eleanor looked toward him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "I know." Brandon lowered his eyes. Shame had fully replaced confidence now. He wanted to explain himself, to justify the pressure of luxury sales, to blame company culture, or expectations, or years of chasing commissions. But none of it sounded meaningful anymore, because the truth was painfully simple. He saw an ordinary pair of shoes and decided the person wearing them deserved less respect. Eleanor finally walked closer toward him again, her footsteps soft against the marble floor. Brandon could not even hold her gaze for long. "Do you know why I still wear these shoes?" she asked quietly. He swallowed hard. "No, ma'am." Eleanor glanced down briefly at the worn leather loafers before answering. "Because my father bought them for me 12 years ago after my first successful investment meeting." Her voice remained steady and calm. "He told me that if success ever changed the way I treated people, then none of it would matter." Brandon felt his throat tighten. Around them, several employees stood completely motionless, listening carefully. Eleanor looked back at him with calm blue eyes untouched by bitterness. "Yesterday you saw old shoes," she said softly. "I saw a memory of the man who taught me dignity." The room went silent once more, and for the first time in years, Brandon Cole truly looked ashamed of himself. The atmosphere inside Colebrook Luxury Motors no longer felt like a luxury showroom. It felt like a courtroom where every polished surface reflected someone's guilt back at them. Rain continued sliding down the massive front windows, while the black Rolls Royce Convoy waited silently outside like a reminder that power rarely announces itself loudly. Eleanor Hayes stood near the Phantom with complete composure, while around her, executives, sales associates, and customers remained trapped inside an uncomfortable silence none of them knew how to break. Richard Langford cleared his throat nervously before stepping closer toward Eleanor. "Miss Hayes," he began carefully, "I assure you changes can be made immediately. We value professionalism here." Eleanor turned slowly toward him. "Professionalism without humanity is performance," she replied softly. "And eventually people notice the difference." Richard lowered his eyes at once. Brandon Cole remained motionless several feet away, his confidence stripped down to something painfully human. For the first time in years, he no longer looked like a powerful sales manager controlling a showroom floor. He looked like a man confronting the consequences of his own character. Eleanor glanced across the dealership one more time, studying the marble floors, the glowing chandeliers, the expensive vehicles lined up beneath soft white lighting. Everything appeared flawless on the surface. Yet underneath all that luxury sat a culture built around making certain people feel worthy and others feel invisible. Charles Whitmore quietly handed Eleanor another document folder. "These are the staffing recommendations," he said. Eleanor opened the folder briefly before closing it again without reading much further. Then she looked directly at Brandon. "Mr. Cole," she said calmly, "how many people have walked through these doors over the years feeling humiliated after speaking with you?" Brandon's jaw tightened. He tried to answer, but no words came out, because deep down, he already knew the answer was probably far too many. Eleanor continued softly, never raising her voice. "Yesterday, it happened to be someone who could buy the company. But what about the people who could not?" The question hung heavily in the air. Several employees shifted uncomfortably while Ethan stood perfectly still near the front desk. Brandon finally lowered his head. "I was wrong," he admitted quietly. Eleanor studied him carefully for several seconds. Most people expected revenge when they witnessed power reverse itself. Public humiliation usually invited public destruction in return, but Eleanor Hayes had never been interested in cruelty. That was the difference between dignity and ego. She handed the staffing folder back to Charles. "Mr. Cole will not be terminated today," she said calmly. Shock rippled visibly through the showroom. Brandon looked up immediately, stunned. Richard Langford blinked in disbelief. Eleanor continued before anyone could speak. "But beginning next week, he will oversee customer relations, retraining personally across every Colebrook location in New England." Brandon stared at her silently. "You are going to spend the next year listening to customer experiences," Eleanor said softly. "Not wealthy customers, all customers." The room remained frozen. Eleanor stepped closer, her voice still calm but impossible to ignore. "If someone walks into this dealership wearing work boots after a 12-hour shift, they deserve respect. If someone saves for 10 years just to sit inside their dream car for 5 minutes, they deserve respect. Human dignity cannot become a luxury item." Ethan felt chills run through him hearing the words. Several employees slowly lowered their eyes in shame. Brandon swallowed hard as emotion tightened unexpectedly in his chest, not because he had been spared embarrassment, but because the woman he humiliated had chosen to teach instead of destroy. Eleanor glanced once more toward her old brown loafers before looking back at Brandon. "Those shoes reminded me where I came from," she said quietly. "Maybe this moment will remind you who you still have time to become." Nobody spoke after that. The room had gone completely silent again. But this time, the silence felt different, not fearful, reflective. By late afternoon, the rain over Boston had softened into a cold mist that blurred the city skyline beyond the towering showroom windows. Yet inside Colebrook Luxury Motors, nobody had returned to normal. Employees spoke in lowered voices. Customers walked more carefully across the marble floors. Even the usual background music now felt strangely distant beneath the weight of everything that had happened that day. Eleanor Hayes remained inside the executive conference room overlooking the showroom, while Charles Whitmore and several senior advisors reviewed transition plans around a long glass table. Through the transparent walls, she could still see Brandon Cole standing near the front desk, unusually quiet, helping an older couple examine a pre-owned sedan with a patience none of his co-workers had ever witnessed from him before. Charles noticed her watching. "Interesting transformation," he remarked softly while organizing paperwork. Eleanor gave a small nod. "Humiliation can harden some people," she replied. "Others finally learn from it." Across the showroom floor, Brandon listened carefully as the elderly man explained that he and his wife had saved for years to replace their aging car after retirement. The couple wore simple clothes, nothing expensive, nothing impressive by luxury showroom standards. Yet this time Brandon did not glance at their shoes or their appearance. He pulled chairs over for them personally and offered coffee without hesitation. Ethan observed the interaction from a distance with quiet disbelief. It was subtle, but everyone could feel the difference. For years, Brandon had treated luxury like membership to an exclusive club. Now, for the first time, he seemed to understand it was supposed to be service instead of superiority. Upstairs, Eleanor stepped away from the conference table and walked toward the massive windows overlooking the dealership entrance, where the black Rolls Royce Convoy still waited beneath gray skies. Her reflection appeared faintly against the glass, beside the city lights beginning to flicker awake for evening. Charles approached quietly beside her. "You surprised everyone today," he admitted. "Most executives would have fired him immediately." Eleanor folded her arms gently. "Punishment changes behavior temporarily," she said softly. "Perspective changes people permanently." Charles studied her for a moment before smiling faintly. "Your father would have been proud of that answer." Eleanor's expression softened at the mention of him. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then movement downstairs caught her attention again. Brandon had just finished helping the elderly couple, and as they slowly walked toward the exit, the older woman reached out and squeezed his hand gratefully. The look on Brandon's face afterward was impossible to fake. Quiet realization, almost shame mixed with relief. Ethan walked over beside him once the couple left. "You handled that differently," he said carefully. Brandon stared toward the glass entrance doors for a long moment before answering. "Yesterday I would have ignored them completely." Ethan nodded slowly. Brandon exhaled heavily and loosened his tie slightly. "I spent years thinking luxury meant making certain people feel important," he admitted quietly. "I never realized how many people I made feel invisible." The words lingered heavily between them. Upstairs, Eleanor heard none of the conversation, yet somehow she already understood it was happening. Because true lessons rarely needed witnesses. They revealed themselves quietly through changed behavior. Charles closed his folder and looked toward the clock on the conference room wall. "The press release goes public in 1 hour," he said. "By tonight, everyone in the industry will know Hayes Automotive Holdings owns Colebrook." Eleanor nodded once before turning back toward the showroom below. Employees continued working beneath crystal chandeliers and polished lights, but something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere. The building still looked luxurious. Yet for the first time all day, it finally felt human. Eleanor glanced down briefly at her old brown loafers, standing against the spotless conference room floor. Shoes Brandon once mocked publicly now carried a lesson that had silenced an entire showroom. And somewhere deep inside Colebrook Luxury Motors, people were beginning to understand that respect should never depend on what someone wears when they walk through the door. That evening, the official acquisition announcement spread through Boston's luxury business circles faster than anyone inside Colebrook Luxury Motors expected. By sunset, industry websites displayed headlines about Hayes Automotive Holdings taking full ownership of the dealership chain, while executives across New England quietly searched for information about the mysterious woman who had built one of the largest automotive investment groups in the country without chasing publicity. Inside the showroom, however, the atmosphere remained strangely reflective rather than celebratory. Employees moved more carefully now, speaking to customers with an attentiveness that had never existed before. It was as if the entire building had suddenly become aware that every interaction mattered. Eleanor Hayes stood near the second-floor balcony overlooking the main showroom while city lights shimmered through the tall glass walls behind her. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets outside glossy beneath the evening traffic. Down below, Brandon Cole remained at the front desk long after most managers would have disappeared into private offices. He personally thanked customers as they left, opened doors himself, and even carried paperwork for an elderly couple struggling with their coats. Several employees exchanged surprised glances each time they noticed it. Ethan eventually walked upstairs carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I thought you might want this," he said carefully as he offered one toward Eleanor. She accepted it with a small smile. "Thank you, Ethan." He leaned slightly against the balcony railing, looking down toward the showroom floor. "I have worked here almost 4 years," he admitted quietly. "Today feels like the first day this place actually deserves to call itself luxury." Eleanor glanced at him thoughtfully. "Real luxury is not price," she replied softly. "It is how people feel after leaving your presence." Ethan absorbed the words silently, while downstairs Brandon continued helping a middle-aged mechanic wearing work clothes, stained with grease from a long shift. The man looked uncomfortable standing among the polished Bentleys and marble floors, but Brandon treated him with complete respect, carefully answering every question without a trace of condescension. Eleanor noticed the interaction immediately. "So did Ethan. You really think people can change that quickly?" he asked. Eleanor looked through the glass railing toward Brandon below. "People rarely change because they are embarrassed," she answered calmly. They change when they finally see themselves clearly. At that same moment, Brandon happened to glance upward toward the balcony. His eyes met Aliner's across the showroom for only a second, but he immediately lowered his gaze with visible humility. No arrogance remained in him anymore. No performance. Just a man carrying the uncomfortable weight of recognizing who he had become over the years. Richard Langford emerged from a nearby office carrying additional transition paperwork before approaching Aliner carefully. "Miss Hayes," he said, "the staff meeting is ready whenever you are." Aliner nodded once and followed him downstairs. Employees slowly gathered near the center of the showroom, beneath the crystal chandelier, while the last evening customers drifted toward the exits. The polished black Phantom remained displayed behind them like a silent witness to everything that had happened over the past 24 hours. Aliner stood quietly in front of the staff for several moments before speaking. "Yesterday," she said softly, "many of you watched someone get judged before she was understood." Nobody moved. Brandon stood near the back of the group, listening carefully. "The truth is," Aliner continued, "most people who walk through these doors are not looking for validation. They are looking for respect." The room stayed completely silent. "A luxury business should never make ordinary people feel unworthy," she said, "because dignity is not something wealthy people deserve more of than everyone else." Several employees lowered their eyes again, while Ethan stood motionless beside the espresso counter. Brandon felt every word settle deeper inside him. Aliner's voice remained calm and steady as she finished. "The cars inside this building are expensive, but kindness costs nothing, and somehow it is still the rarest thing people encounter." For several seconds after she stopped speaking, nobody said a single word. The silence that followed no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt honest. 3 months later, Colebrook Luxury Motors no longer resembled the dealership it had once been. The marble floors still gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers. The rows of Rolls Royces and Bentleys still reflected soft white light across the showroom each morning. But the atmosphere had changed in ways money alone could never purchase. Customers no longer entered the building with hesitation in their eyes. Receptionists greeted every visitor warmly regardless of clothing or appearance. Sales associates offered coffee to construction workers with the same respect they showed corporate executives arriving in tailored suits. And quietly, almost unbelievably, customer satisfaction across every Colebrook location had risen higher than at any point in company history. The transformation became something people across Boston actually talked about. Some called it brilliant leadership. Others called it a miracle. But the employees inside the building understood the truth. It all began with one woman wearing old brown loafers who refused to let humiliation turn her cruel. On a cold December afternoon, soft snow drifted outside the showroom windows, while Brandon Cole stood near the entrance, helping a young father explore financing options for a reliable used sedan. The man looked nervous discussing his budget inside a luxury dealership, but Brandon treated him with complete patience and respect. Ethan watched the interaction from nearby and shook his head in quiet amazement. If someone had described this version of Brandon 6 months earlier, nobody inside Colebrook would have believed it possible. The customer eventually smiled gratefully before leaving with his young daughter holding his hand tightly. Brandon opened the door for them personally, watching the little girl wave excitedly as snowflakes drifted around them outside. For a moment, he simply stood there silently beneath the winter light, reflecting across the marble floor. Then he noticed a familiar dark gray sedan pulling slowly into the circular driveway. The entire showroom subtly straightened at once. Aliner Hayes stepped out wearing a simple cream coat and the same old brown loafers that had unknowingly changed an entire company. She never announced her visits ahead of time. She preferred seeing people honestly rather than watching them prepare performances for leadership. Brandon immediately walked toward the entrance, but this time there was no arrogance in his posture, only respect. "Good afternoon, Miss Hayes," he said sincerely as he opened the glass doors for her. Elena glanced around the showroom quietly while snow swirled softly outside behind her. She noticed employees greeting customers warmly. She noticed the relaxed atmosphere. Most importantly, she noticed people no longer looked afraid of being judged the moment they walked through the door. "It feels different here," she said softly. Brandon nodded once. "It is." For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Brandon looked down briefly at her old loafers before meeting her eyes again. "I think about those shoes almost every day now," he admitted quietly. Elena smiled faintly. "Why?" Brandon exhaled slowly. "Because they remind me how easy it is to mistake appearance for value." The words carried no defensiveness anymore, only honesty. Elena studied him carefully before giving a small approving nod. Nearby, Ethan watched the exchange with quiet admiration. The same showroom that once echoed with laughter at someone's expense now stood filled with calm professionalism and dignity. Elena slowly removed her gloves while snow melted softly against the windows behind her. "My father used to say something," she said gently. "He believed the true measure of success was not whether people admired you when you walked into a room." Brandon listened carefully. Elena's calm blue eyes moved across the showroom one final time before she finished speaking. "It was whether ordinary people felt respected after you left it." The room fell silent again, but unlike before, the silence no longer carried shame or tension. It carried understanding. And as soft winter light reflected across the polished marble floors of Colebrook Luxury Motors, everyone inside the building finally understood something expensive cars could never teach them on their own. Dignity has nothing to do with wealth, and respect should never depend on a pair of shoes.